Hello, BookTube. Matthew at Mayberry Book Club and I have turned the name of his channel into a literal reality, into a book club for two. And we are reading books together, one a month, till he drops dead of old age. And this month he decided that the book we're reading he indulged me. Every August I reread Homer's Odyssey. And he knew that. He's read it a couple of times, and he decided, I told him we can pick a different book. You don't have to, I don't need any company on my read-along of the Odyssey, but he was perfectly happy to do that, so that's what we're doing. We're reading the Odyssey. And we are at part 3. We're reading it 6 books at a time, and we are at part 3 in the Fagles translation. This is the Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition with the French flaps on the deckled edges, and also with I've got the company of a student dude bro. I would ordinarily have dropped the book like a hot potato if it had this much underlining and marginalia in it. But like I mentioned in an earlier video, it is absolutely adorable to watch this kid start out by making notes in the margins that his teacher was clearly saying in class, and then get caught up in the story and start to make very personal annotations about how the momentary turn of the story is affecting him. That was fantastic to watch. And despite how many thousands of years it's been since this poem was written, that will still happen. This is a surefire thing. And the Fagles translation is very good. And in the books that we're reading today, the stereotypical parts of the Odyssey are over. Matthew makes a point in his video. I'll leave a link to his video down below. He makes a point that he doesn't make it as strongly as I want to make it, but he makes the point that the most polished, narratively, the most polished parts of the Odyssey, and also the most enjoyable parts of the Odyssey, are not the most famous parts. We just did the most famous parts when Odysseus is talking. He's in a foreign land. He's hoping that they will bankroll his trip finally to get home to Ithaca, because he's just a wanderer. By this point, he's lost his crew. He's lost every vessel. Almost the clothes on his back, literally the clothes on his back. So he's hoping for the mercy of the kingdom on where he's washed up. And when he's entertaining at their court, he tells them stories about his famous adventures, and they are his famous adventures. They are the adventure of the sirens, his trip to the underworld, his encounter with the Cyclops. Many of you have been listening to me talk about these stories and mentioned that I mentioned that I wrote a story about the Odyssey in the form of a novel called Steve Donoghue's Ulysses. And a number of you were asking, well, you must have had a lot of fun with the Cyclops episode, you know, with Odysseus and his crew encountering this ravenous giant that's eating his men one at a time or two at a time. And I did. I had an enormous amount of fun with the Cyclops. And I made a choice that I thought was crucial to up the horror factor of that incident. And that was to make Cyclops normal human size. My Cyclops, my Polyphemus, is normal human size. He's still monstrous. He's still, wide and powerful, inhumanly strong. Still one eye. But he's human size. So when he grabs a crew member and rips them apart and starts to eat them, I thought, anyway, naturally I'm partial because I was the author, I thought that increased the horror quite a bit. It was certainly fun to write. But all of those adventures, all of those adventures that come to mind the minute you think about the Odyssey, those are all done by the time we get to the ending of this book. Half the book is the story of Odysseus' homecoming that most people don't know in any kind of detail. They know his adventures out and about, adventures that Matthew thinks he's just plain lying about, but they don't know the story of his homecoming, which is, I agree with Matthew here, beautifully done. Just in terms of narrative tension, of narrative energy, it's beautifully done. Far more beautifully done, I would say, than the middle parts that are famous. It harks back to the beginning of the epic, which is a tense and multi-layered family drama about not about Odysseus, but about his wife and his son. Odysseus goes to the Trojan War, spends 10 years there, then spends 10 years traveling back home, and in that whole time, his queen, Penelope, is alone. He apparently doesn't leave a steward to rule his kingdom in his stead. And his son, Telemachus, is just a baby and grows up. So Telemachus is a teen dream. when we meet him in the Odyssey. And at the beginning, in that opening of the epic, he goes out and about looking for news about his father. I guess he's waited long enough. And at one point, he goes to the court of wily old King Nestor, the oldest character at Troy in the Iliad, and meets Nestor's teen dream son, Pisistratus, and they go looking for more stories about the fate of Odysseus. They go looking for more stories from other survivors of Troy. They go together. They are rather close. They are the same age. Which is, good for Nestor. But anyway, then we cut to Odysseus' adventures. He is set free from Calypso's island. And when he finally gets to the court of the Phaeacians, he starts telling all of his stories. All these larger-than-life stories that Matthew just doesn't believe. But then he gets home. Then he finally does wash up on the shores of Ithaca, surrounded by a divine mist, so he doesn't at first know where he is. The first thing he checks on is whether or not the treasures that his hosts loaded him with are still there, and they are. So he arrives at Ithaca with a staggering amount of wealth and property. Not technically as a beggar, but Athena disguises him as a beggar. She appears to him and disguises him as a beggar. He says to her, among many other things, he says, "Oh, goddess, it's so hard to tell when you're in disguise among us mortals. You do it so well. It's so hard to tell." I had a wonderful time in both my novelization of the Iliad, Troy War, and also in Steve Donoghue's Ulysses, describing the relationship between this one mortal and this one god. My gods are weird, inhuman creatures who are usually deadly to humans, but something like affection springs up between this one immortal and this one mortal. And my gods in Troy War and Steve Donoghue's Ulysses are not good at disguising themselves at all, because mere proximity to them causes humans to projectile vomit. And this is no different. And so when I have my Ulysses say that line in Steve Donoghue's Ulysses, the reader knows it's clearly sarcasm. It's clearly him praising someone who may be as powerful as a sun going supernova, but who is mentally sort of a child. In this, we don't know if Homer meant it sarcastically. I think Homer did. But Odysseus goes to the humble country lodge of his former swineherd, Eumaeus. Oh my swineherd, Eumaeus, who has been loyal to Odysseus the whole time. He's been faithfully waiting for his master to return. And the first thing that Odysseus does to the little girl, first of all, who discovers him on the beach, is lie. The first thing he does is make up a lie, an elaborate lie, a long story that isn't anything true, no truth in it at all. And then he goes in disguise. He's disguised as a feeble beggar. He goes to Eumaeus, oh my swineherd, and immediately lies. Tells him a different lie than he told the little girl, and one that's every bit as elaborate, more so. We get a wonderful scene where he's approaching the swineherd's country lodge when the dogs come running down the lane, barking and growling, and Odysseus sits on the ground as a sort of a signal to them that he is not a danger, and thereby saves himself from a shameful mauling. That's what we're called. I don't ever look at that scene without remembering some of my own travels, because that scene will play itself out. If you go into the back roads, into the countryside, into the sticks, in this country or any other country, that is going to happen to you. The dogs, who are free and scrabble about the property and who are largely vicious to strangers, will come charging. They will find you, and you could risk a shameful mauling if the owner of the dogs doesn't get there fast enough. Except in my case, that was never true in my case, and often led to the special character of a lot of my visits in those backwoods places, because those dogs would come charging down the lane, and then we would start to talk. And speak of the devil, those encounters never went the way the dog owners thought. So the dog owners would come rushing down, or even sauntering down the lane right after the dogs, and find a total stranger that they were totally enjoying, no aggression whatsoever, even when that stranger, as is always the case, had dogs of his own. And that often sparked conversations. That often said, well, you could see it changing in the owners' minds too. Well, I don't recognize this person. but my dogs are okay with him, so he must be okay. That gave me entree to a lot of places that I imagine a lot of strangers would not have had entree to. Totally grateful for that. And I always remember it when I think about that scene when Odysseus is approaching the humble abode of Eumaeus, my swineherd. And while he's there, Telemachus returns to Ithaca. He says goodbye to Pisistratus. A telling little scene. Pisistratus tells him, well, you'd better hurry. You better take ship and hurry away. Because I know perfectly well, if we go back to Pylos, if we go back to Nestor, he won't let you go. Or he'll want to do it himself, and he'll take his time doing it. And if you're in a hurry, you should go now, and I'll deal with him. It's an odd moment. It's an odd little note that's never pursued. Of course, we don't know anything more about Nestor than we learn in the Odyssey. But it's a darker side of him, a side of him that we had no indication of at all anywhere else in Homer. Pisistratus makes it pretty clear that he is headed for an awkward and maybe even violent homecoming. But Telemachus goes on his way. He arrives. He is safeguarded by Athena. He goes to Ithaca, and he eventually goes to the hut of Eumaeus, oh my swineherd. The dogs recognize him. They don't try to attack him at all. And he meets this disheveled old beggar. But it's really his father. And when the disguise drops, it's a wonderful, wonderful scene. We're told in the narrative that the two of them could easily, they're crying, both of them, and they could easily cry all night. They're so happy to see each other. It's such a wonderful reunion. And it might strike the reader, if you're reading this for the first time, you might think, well, it's kind of odd that Telemachus would doubt it. That when the disguise drops, you'd say, well, I think you're just a god, cheating my vision. I think this is some sort of spell. I don't know what to believe. But keep in mind, this is not the era of photography. Telemachus has never seen his father before. Might have seen some kind of portrait, but I doubt it. I doubt even that. So how would he know? He knows only, I think the reason that he knows is because in that moment, the beggar's physical appearance changes in an obviously supernatural way. Right there in the hut, the person looks different. And confronted with that, I think that's the reason why Telemachus would think, oh, well, you must be him. Because unlike a few other people in the books that we'll be finishing up with next week, Telemachus has no way of identifying he has no trick, no secret knowledge, no way of identifying whether or not a stranger is actually Odysseus. Whereas Eurycleia, his old nurse, does have a way. His wife, Penelope, does have a way. And there's a dog who has the best way of all. There's an old dog who Odysseus left for Troy when the dog was a puppy, and the dog has grown up the whole time. And Homer gives us he doesn't go out of his way very much to belabor the fact that the dog not only recognizes his owner after all that time, but can easily see through the disguise of a goddess. What difference does that make to the loyalty of a dog to his master? My point being that in the next batch of books that we read, we're going to see it is possible to verify this. You don't need the gods to tell you that this is Odysseus. It's possible to verify who he is. But the key thing here, the key thing that is building inexorably in the books that we're reading today, is something that Matthew pinpoints as well, which is how expertly this is done. You may have expected earlier in the epic that Odysseus would come home to Ithaca and it would be a grand homecoming. The king has returned. Fantastic. So these loutish suitors who've been hanging around in his hall and eating his food and drinking his wine and trying to get Penelope to pick one of them to be the new king, they would just disperse. Oh, the king is back. Aren't we happy? But no, not at all. If you ever had those illusions earlier in the poem, you dispel them in these books. This is Odysseus needing to retake his kingdom. And he and his son and maybe Eumaeus, they're a tiny handful against a crowd of loutish, yes, but young and capable suitors, some of whom have kingdoms of their own. We're told that some of them come from neighboring islands. No small thing, in other words. And notice, despite the fact that Odysseus can be on the beach joking and joshing with Athena, who he calls the warrior's goddess, he doesn't at all expect her to help him. Not at all. He doesn't bring it up to her, even when he talks to her. She's hiding his true appearance. She's hiding his land from him. She's removing the mist and showing him his land. She's changing his appearance back to his normal appearance. In all those times, he never says to her, well, I'm going to need your help to clear out the suitors and reclaim my kingdom. He doesn't do it. He just assumes he's going to have to do it on his own. And the tension of that homecoming, the tension of that Clint Eastwood confrontation, is built marvelously in these books, just marvelously. Yes, other things are happening. The father and son reunion is happening. But there's this massive task ahead, and it requires guile, it requires preparation, and it requires insiders who know what's going on. Crucially, the weapons in the hall have to be locked up. The suitors have to be helpless, or as helpless as you can make them. And all of that explodes in the next 6 books. The way this thing ends, the way this story ends is terrific. Just terrific. I would argue that in our 20th, 21st century idea of a conventional fictional narrative, I would argue that the Iliad is anticlimactic. If you have learned how to read fiction from novels, then if you're reading the Iliad for the first time, you're going to say, why does this end? This isn't what I was expecting at all. Either end with the death of Hector, or end with the fall of Troy. But what's all this? And I argue there are many, many reasons why I think the Odyssey is more popular than the Iliad. One, as I mentioned, is that it's much shorter. Never discount that. Never discount that at all. Another is that it has a far more centralized narrative. But another reason would be that it does have something that much more closely approximates the climax and standard denouement of normal post-Samuel Richardson fiction. It's far more, if you have been trained down to your reading DNA to understand stories in terms of novels, this is going to be much closer to your bag, as kids used to say, than anything in the Iliad. And we'll find out together that is true, because we'll be finishing up the Odyssey next weekend. Next weekend rings out the month of August. And Matthew and I have quite a few good plans in store for the Mayberry Book Club after this. But in terms of today's chapters, today's books of the Odyssey, I would tend to agree with my esteemed co-host that this is better than all of those lying tales that Odysseus tells in the course of the famous part of this poem, which we just finished. I would argue that this is better, far more compelling, far more human. So that's our Odyssey read-along for today, for part 3. And keep in mind, I am not a normal sexy influencer on YouTube. So I'm not doing calls to action. I'm not calling you guys or fam. I'm not directing you to my merch store. And I don't do anything like that because we're just having conversations. But if I were to do a call to action for this video, if I were going to tell you to smash that like button, I would say to do it because I have managed to get through the whole of this video without using Roman names for these characters. I consider that a massive achievement. I think the rest of my Sunday is probably all downhill from there. So you don't have to smash the like button, but you could give me a little pat on the head for not lapsing, as the number of you have told me I've done in the previous videos. So I'm going to wrap this up, but we will be back to finish up the Odyssey next week. Thank you, BookTube.